can I just ask a few questions to start with? I mean, how many of you are actually really familiar with PCI DSS? So you actually have to comply with it as part of your organization, or you're helping people comply with it? Yep, okay. And give it a couple of seconds. Do you sit with auditors much? Do you actually, yep, so you're gathering evidence and giving it to them? Cool, all right. I won't rush through too much. About the first half of the presentation is probably maybe informational. It may not be relevant to you guys, but there's probably other people in the room who may not be familiar, so I'll get through it and try to get to the meat of the actual presentation. The accent is Australian, it's not Kiwi, just in case anyone was wondering. Over from Australia, so going through it. There's not much. New Zealand's a state we don't want to manage. It's kind of like running a lean startup out of, as opposed to out of a big organization. Yeah, it's better for all of us, really. What I'm actually hoping you'll get out of this, as I kind of mentioned, is a bit better understanding of PCI DSS and formal hardening options and how they're connected. A lot of people don't seem to actually understand that. Some of the discussions I've had with people over the last couple of days as well has kind of indicated that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what hardening is, SCAP content, that kind of thing. So that's the informational part. Also dig into why I think Salt's ideal for it. I'm probably trying to sell the converted on that, but it's perfect for it. The problems that you are definitely going to run into if you try and do this across multi-OS. Again, talking to people a lot in the last few days, most people are, they're running cloud-based businesses and pretty much everything's Linux. I'll get into the reason why we had to do this shortly, but if you try and do this across Windows and Linux, Windows and Mac, you will run into a lot of issues. And what I think the ideal solution looks like, which, after seeing the Salt presentation with Salt Enterprise, I'm very impressed by that. I'd love to actually trial that. But I think there's another solution that could be built that would be more relevant to the open source community. So the customer scenario, the whole reason this came about, basically they were a small startup business, about 100 staff, been around for about 8 years, and they just spent nothing on security. Like I think they bought a few licenses for some kind of antivirus, but that was literally the extent of their spending. And they were building cloud applications, running them AWS, they're handling credit card transactions, not actually storing them, but handling them. And they had a pretty good DevOps type setup, good CD, CI type pipeline. They knew what they were doing. Not Salt users, sadly. They were using, they were big on their Puppet. But it was the exact kind of team that you could potentially introduce Salt to, and they'd be able to pick it up and run with it. And they also wanted to actually get some security benefit beyond just the box ticking of, hey, yeah, we're compliant. A lot of organizations rather, spend a lot of money on PCI DSS, and it doesn't really improve their security posture at all. It just ticks the box and allows them to continue operating. So PCI DSS compliance regime, enforced by Visa, MasterCard. There's some heavy fines from them if you don't do it, but it's not really all that hard to achieve. It's mostly about process, but it usually tells you to go somewhere else for technical requirements. And the one that specifically relates to this is that requirement 2.2, which basically tells you to go away, find an industry-accepted security hardening standard. Hardening, though, most people think of it, like that's running a bunch of commands. We'll just run a script and that'll harden the box, right? Like, it's not that. It really isn't, and it definitely isn't if it's a script you found on Stack Overflow or somewhere else. It's not even the Salt formulas that you'll find on GitHub. You jump on there, do a search, you'll probably come up with a dozen or more. Some of them do stuff, some of them do useful things. Most of them don't do anything useful, in my opinion. They'll give you a false sense of comfort that something's actually happening. But it is actually the implementation of security controls, and it's all about just reducing risk. Like it's not going to be a perfect solution. It's not going to make things perfect. It's just going to reduce risk, and that's why organizations do it, and they need to do it. The way that's sort of structured is controls. PCI DSS has got 12 in 5 groups. The main one that's of relevance is number 2. Basically says don't use vendor supplied defaults because vendors don't really know what they're doing, and they're not there in the business of providing you a truly secure OS. They're there in the business of providing one that actually works for the largest segment of customers they can possibly get it to. So That's how to make money. And there is a number of standards out there. They've changed over the years. You know, I first got involved with PCI DSS back in the early 2000s. You know, SANS was still a really good resource. It isn't anymore. It basically hasn't been updated in 10 years or more for the most part. And if you dig around on the SANS website, they will actually point you to CIS. So don't go there for their score checklists anymore. They're basically a waste of time. Other things like ISO 27K, too high level, doesn't go into technical details, won't help you harden anything, will tell you to write your own documents. The NIST National Checklist Program looks good on the surface once you dig into it. It's all vendor content, so some of it's been updated, some of it hasn't. When you dig into things, they either have PDFs, they might have some SCAP content, but in particular for Linux, Windows, and Mac, they're pretty much going to point you to CIS anyway. I wasn't actually very familiar with the DSA STIG stuff until like the last week. Given it's a US military thing, it's just never really crossed my radar. It's been interesting looking at it, but even looking at it in the last couple of days, you know, they really only have a benchmark for Ubuntu with one version, so it's not going to apply in a lot of environments. It's very military focused from what I can tell. CIS is still your best bet for a formal hardening guide. They do have some free content. You know, there's the PDFs, but it's the meat of it's probably, in my opinion, the best part is the actual machine readable formats, SCAP content. But again, this is something I came across. Some people actually didn't know that CIS is it's a non-profit org. Like a lot of people are using their PDFs. They're implementing, you know, SALT formulas and things based on them. They're doing different stuff based on them, but they don't actually know it's a non-profit org. It doesn't actually cost all that much to become a member, to get involved in that community. Their free tools are actually pretty good if you have a very small environment. If you've got a large one, you won't want to, and you want to actually become a subscription member. My business is, you know, given it's less than 50 people and under a particular revenue number, I think it was less than $1,000 a year to become a member. So it's reasonably affordable. Go back to the website and take a look if you're actually interested in that. There was another part of what I've seen is that people don't really understand the hardening process, and that the fact that it's part of a larger life cycle. You know, it's like a CDCI type pipeline. You actually need to define what you're going to do, audit it, remediate it, and the remediation part isn't so much ticking a box. If any of you sat in that presentation yesterday afternoon with the whack-a-mole, I really liked that because that was a really good representation of the way most people remediate stuff. They deploy systems and they just kind of whack stuff, and it comes back the next time they deploy them. That whole life cycle needs to be very clearly defined, and that remediation component needs to be, anytime something kind of comes up, you need to understand what it is, roll it back into formulas, deploy it again, verify that it's not there, repeat process. There's a lot of tools out there that you could use. A lot of commercial ones, a bunch of open source ones. The most simple ones, of course, are like Windows GPOs. They actually achieve a hell of a lot of things. Out of all the commercial ones, I haven't really used many of them. There's Tripwire was the last thing I used, and that made me want to put a gun in my mouth and shoot myself. It was very reminiscent of the late 90s last time I used it, and it was terrible. So I'd avoid all of those. You probably saw SCAP in there. Again, I think a lot of people don't understand what SCAP actually is. It's an umbrella term for a bunch of standards released by NIST. They're actually not too bad. They really define in machine-readable, consumable formats how to actually check things, how to fix things, how to identify if something is vulnerable, what a device really is. So SCAP sort of covers that entire content. They have different formats. It's a very weird landscape to try and navigate. Took me weeks of reading to really get a good picture in my head. So if you haven't done that yet, have fun. The CIS benchmarks basically implement SCAP. I think they actually produce their PDFs from their XML content, because that's pretty much what it looks like there. I'm not sure if anyone can actually see that very well on the screen, but it's an XML file. Everything that's in the PDF is in that XML file. And you get access to the XML file as a CIS subscription member. XML defines how to do stuff, defines how to remediate stuff, but every implementation of SCAP I've looked at so far is unique at this point. They do everything uniquely in their own little way. CIS is no exception. And it's probably partly due to versioning. I think the original SCAP definition came out around 2011. They released, I think it was 2010, they released 1.2 in 2011, and 1.3 came out early this year. So hopefully people will really commit to conforming to a consistent standard with it, sort of starting this year. Because at the moment, nothing's compatible with anything else from what I've seen. Back to that customer scenario, the reason we picked Salt, apart from the fact they had that DevOps team that was actually going to be able to deal with it, was it really does work well enough across Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's the automation of the hardening and the remediation, the investigation as well. We were applying hardening against Mac, Windows, and Linux desktops and laptops, like stuff that's moving around. You don't have staff who can go and jump on it. So we wanted a remote execution capability for things that are online, as well as a way to actually collect information for systems that are offline or only popping up online every now and again. I think that's, even in production environments, like with data centers maybe distributed around the world, I think that's still highly relevant. Salt's really, really good at being able to create a situation in which it'll collect evidence for you and gather it and put it somewhere useful, without you ever having to really sort of connect into a box. With that whole life cycle, I think I may have actually dropped a slide out of this one, but there's a lot of people miss the SOE component, and I think this is because as we move into this sort of cloudy world, people really are just deploying images en masse, not really defining what they look like prior to deployment, not actually making them secure prior to deployment. A lot of people just use the regular run-of-the-mill Amazon AMIs, and then they kind of do hardening later. So there's a window of opportunity in which that system's deployed that it may not actually be secure. It may be vulnerable to something. The AMIs, yeah, they're pretty good, but what about what you put on top of them? How does that interact with the underlying OS? And in particular, in that customer scenario, it was the bare metal systems. They had, when we actually asked them, what do you have? What models? What versions of Windows? What versions of Mac? They literally didn't know. So everything had to be rebuilt to a hardened and understood image. So they basically went to Windows. Didn't actually go to Windows Enterprise. It was Windows 10 Pro. Shifted everything up to the latest version of macOS 10.13, and it basically shifted all the developers onto CentOS as a workstation. Some of them not happy with that. Some of them wanted to use Ubuntu, but they wanted to actually be secure, and there was not really any other option than to standardize on one. Salt can't really build the SOEs for you. There's a whole bunch of other tools for that. I'm not going to go into it. Can really help with actually building those SOE or configuring the SOE image to a point that it can be imaged though. So that might just be deploying that vanilla AMI from Amazon, configuring it up, hardening it, and then converting it into an hardened AMI that you start using yourself. Can't immediately consume SCAP, sadly, but it is Python, so with a little bit of work that's possible. It really comes into its own in that post-deploy state auditing and remediation. Installing whatever tools you need, auditing whatever you need, remediating things, collecting evidence. The compliance and auditing part is, I spent about seven or 8 years working for a financial services organization and working very closely with auditors, collecting that evidence. And a lot of the time they actually just want a text file. They don't want any fancy document. They just want a text file that literally shows how a system is configured, whether it's in sync with a particular time source. But we wasted a lot of my own time, a lot of other engineers' time on collecting that evidence. The auditor would come in, spend a month or two with us, and they just pick systems at random. Once we actually really started using Salt to collect evidence in that environment and just simply have it on hand, it made all of our lives so much easier. The auditor, we'd just give them a bundle. We'd just give them a USB disk with all the evidence on it in text file format. Here you go, pick your systems, it's already done. You can do it from a cafe. As I said, the auditors are happy with that most of the time, unless you get a really picky one, in which case, find another one. The auditing and remediation tools, again, like they need to be updated themselves. Again, it's not a case of whack-a-mole, just kind of, click the button, I fixed it, oh, it came back. Needs to be rolled in. Again, Salt is, I think, perfect for that. When you start to get into the tools, though, you come across OpenSCAP. It's really good if you're a pure Linux environment. It's not any good if you are using anything else, because it just doesn't work on it. It should be possible to get it on there, but it doesn't at this point. They do their own version of XSCDF handling, so parsing the XML, and they don't like the CIS XML files. So you can't actually use OpenSCAP with the CIS content immediately. It's very annoying, but that's what it is. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. CIS-CAP Pro, the subscriber-only tool from CIS, is about your only option if you are going to try and do this across Windows, Linux, and Mac. The reason it is because of Java, which is terrible. A little bit of a security issue maybe, but I mean, you just install it. Don't install browser plugins. Don't let it do anything else. It's just there literally to run the jar file for CIS-CAP Pro, or it should be. It is quite configurable though with what it can output. So it's not just HTML. It's got the ARF stuff. It's got OVAL. It's got XML. And I mean, if you want to work with CSVs as well, maybe even input them into Salt, like that's what it can do. It's intended though to actually send the XML content to the CIS-CAP dashboard. And the dashboard, again, sadly, Java-based, absolutely disgusting. Needs Tomcat 8. Can't remember exactly why. If you're running like CentOS 7, you will not be able to deploy this immediately easily. You'll have to go and roll your own Apache Tomcat. Wants a SQL database. I think you can use MySQL. I think it really wants PostgreSQL or MS SQL. Haven't really delved into it too much. Does do LDAP, does work with AD, does work with a bunch of cloud providers that I use with LDAP. So that's actually not too bad. So it's got the role-based access control. The web UI is a little bit terrible. I don't particularly like it, and it runs about as terribly as you'd expect any sort of Java-based web app to. It's got all the issues of scaling. When I do jump into the demo, you may get to see that it doesn't respond very well. It really is just an interpreter for looking at HTML content. Not a fan. The recommended automation is really terrible as well. It really is just bash scripts and cron or scheduled jobs. You will get it automated, but you have no visibility of how it's operating, when it's operating, unless you actually get a report come in. There's also a manual step involved in actually creating an API user and the tokens. There doesn't seem to be, I think I mentioned there was a REST API there, but I haven't found any documentation for that at this point. It's basically something you should avoid. And the reason is, this is kind of what it would look like if you were to deploy it that way. The minions be posting stuff to the CIS dashboard, be relying on a SQL database. If you had a lot of minions, you would need to scale out. You'd have all the traditional problems of scaling a traditional Java-style web application out. This is what we actually did for the customer, though. We got rid of the dashboard at the very least. When I dug into it, and given my experience with auditors, it was kind of like, the dashboard isn't going to really add much value. The HTML reports are the real meat, because that you can give to an auditor. That's the evidence. It's easy for them to look at and view and find what they want. It's easy for an engineer as well to go through, look at things, what's not actually passing, how should I fix that, and then roll that back into their deployment process. So we've got Salt to basically schedule the CIS-CAT runs regularly on the minions using copy.push. Skip on to the next page. Using copy.push to pull the report information back up to the master, and the master had its own state that would periodically just punch everything up into an S3 bucket. And that's the core of it there. It really is. It's just 4 things. In the initial iteration. A little bit ugly, actually worked really well. Any Amazon S3 buckets have their own role-based access control, so you can give an auditor access. You can give your staff access to read, and you don't need to really reinvent the wheel and have a dashboard. It doesn't need a full application when all you really need is that role-based access control. So the net result for that customer was they had all the hardened SOEs deployed, all their desktops, all their systems internally, rebuilt, actually hardened properly. Salt Minion on everything. Daily hardening audit to start with, basically as they were kind of working on fixing things that kept cropping up. Salt was actually doing automatic remediation for Linux and Mac. I call it remediation in the sense that it was really just applying formulas to basically configure things correctly. It wasn't using the SCAP content to do remediation based on the way CIS recommends doing it. I don't think anyone should do that. They're examples of how to remediate things. They provide a really good guide, but they may not be relevant to your environment. Little things like how to configure PAM files on Linux, their descriptions are, in my opinion, not relevant. You're better off using, particularly on CentOS, authconfig or something like that. With Windows, we didn't have to do much at all. Basically, AD GPOs, if you actually import the remediation content that CIS provides as a subscription member, those GPOs will fix 99% of your Windows issues. Basically that first scan against a Windows system after those GPOs have been applied to it on level 1, we'll actually get it up to about a 98%, 99% pass mark. So that was actually really good to see. Didn't want to deal with that. We had the HTML reports in the S3 bucket, as I mentioned. It was doing the role-based access control. S3 also does the auto archiving and removal. You can even enable encryption. So it's, in my opinion, just getting these HTML reports into an S3 bucket does 95% of what you probably need to do in order to collect this kind of evidence and make it available to people, either for the compliance auditor to look at or just for engineers to access and work out how to fix things. There's a few gotchas though. Like I was still getting used to, I guess, really writing complex SALT formulas and states at the time. My first way of deploying CIS-CAP was using file.recurse, which is woefully bad, particularly on Windows. If you have the clean option enabled, which is the default, it'll basically lock the minion up. So don't do it that way. Most of us probably know that by now, but I didn't when I first did it. Those CIS HTML ARF reports, even the XML style output, can actually get huge. 10 meg or even 20 meg is quite common. On a Windows like Active Directory controller, you expect 20 meg. And that adds up, so when you've got hundreds of minions punching stuff into S3 on a regular basis, it can actually get quite expensive. Initially attempted to use the salt mine to transfer things. That was actually when I became really aware that the file size was that big. Salt mine's not intended for that. It's intended for really, really small bits of information. File.read from the master can work. Actually works quite well if you want to collect files off a minion, but it doesn't work well on large files either. Again, it choked, it just killed them. And those minions on Windows and macOS, they just by default do not have a lot of stuff that you might actually really need. My best example of that's probably M2 crypto. So if you need to deploy CA certificates, or you want to do your own sort of CA via Salt, and punch in some private keys and certificates that have been signed by your Salt CA, you will have issues trying to do anything useful without having to write things from scratch. And in particular, macOS, like if you go and try and get that installed, like you pretty much got to install Xcode from what I can tell. There's now a GitHub repo that I've thrown a bunch of stuff in there that's useful, including a way to automatically install Xcode on macOS. without any GUI interaction, which is what Apple normally tries to force you to do. Don't use the Salt Pi 3 packages. I'm not sure if anyone's attempted to deploy minions using Python 3. I've heard other people complain about it, and my experience was pretty much the same. It just breaks a lot of things, in particular the S3 module. And it seems to do with encoding. I don't know, basically just kind of looked at it, went, this is a Python 3 issue, and went back to Python 2, and everything worked. If you're in a security environment, Salt minions and the CIS-CAT tools in particular on Windows will look like malware. They will look like a rootkit, and any kind of decent enterprise software, security software is going to flag it. You're going to need to whitelist all of this stuff. So this is where I'll be dumping a formula that I've written based on this experience with the customer. I sort of, in the last few weeks, have just taken what was originally written and completely done it again from scratch. It now actually does do OpenSCAP on Linux. So on Windows and Mac, it will run the CIS-CAP Pro tools. You can optionally deploy the CIS dashboard if you want. It'll help you deploy Tomcat, just the whole thing. It is pretty much apart from setting up the SQL database, it does everything else you need there. It's configurable via Pillar to basically, whatever reporting format you want. If you want the machine readable ones, cool, pull those out. If you want the HTML ones, it'll grab those. It'll either send them to the CIS dashboard if you want to run that, or it'll pull them through the master and send them to an S3 bucket. And I'll jump out and quickly start a live demo. That will take a few minutes. So if we go back again. So this is basically how you can use it. There's some top-level abstraction, so you can just apply CIS.audit, and depending on how you've configured Pillar, it'll either deploy and run CIS-CAT tools, or it'll deploy and run OpenSCAP. It'll build a schedule. It uses the Salt scheduler for it, so the minion always does need to be running. But in our case, that shouldn't really be an issue. That abstraction basically goes down to two different directories, one for CIS-CAT, one for OpenSCAP. So it'll basically help you get all those tools deployed, make sure they're updated really easily. Help deploy Java, particularly on Mac, which is a bit of a pain in the bum. You do need to host your own package for JDK on Mac, but that's about the only manual step involved. I've also got a series of formulas that are available. Now, my experience trying to do this, even on Linux, was that a lot of the existing Salt formulas just do not do what you need to do in order to hit as many of the CIS items as possible. You could edit the XML files and just turn everything off. That sort of creates a red flag, but that's not really what you're supposed to do, and not really what you should be doing. And then it's little things like removing or configuring prelink properly. Simply removing the package isn't necessarily what you want to achieve with prelink. You actually need to remove that cleanly. The original formulas for at and cron just didn't configure it the way CIS tells you to configure it, and they've actually got some good points about how to configure it. Basically making sure that only root can use it. They may not be relevant to your environment. You may want users to be able to set up their own cron jobs, but they're there. So if I jump back to this one, we should hopefully have some reports. So the state really is really just running Java. Builds a command line, a set of command line arguments in order to do something useful. And in this case, punches it out to the CIS dashboard, which looks like this. If I can type the password properly. So we've got 5 different minions. We've got a Windows domain controller, Windows 10 enterprise desktop, a couple of Linux boxes, and a macOS box. It is actually running 10.13, but because the SCAP content for 10.13 hasn't been released, we've had to assess it based on the 10.12 benchmark, which is one of the reasons why it's down so low at like 78.21%. Also because it's being assessed at level 2 versus level 1. This is where I really don't like the dashboard. So if we click into there, that actually loaded pretty quickly right now. But if we attempt to, it's going to try and load all these subgroups, and sometimes that can take minutes. Like this is a pretty high performance machine. It's not doing much else. There's 8 cores. It's all running off SSDs. You know, it's just the usual problem with Java web apps. I assume it's probably attempting to render something in browser as well, but I don't know what it's doing. Not particularly interested in finding out either. So when you go through the dashboard, and this is why you'll probably come to the conclusion that it doesn't really suit your needs, is it's really just regurgitating the PDF content or the SCAP content. It is kind of useful for an engineer maybe to browse through it, take a look at things. You know, oh, okay, I need to run this defaults write command in order to configure this thing. But apart from that, it doesn't do much. There is this add exception, so next time a report comes in, it basically won't apply that. But that's all it does. It doesn't even do alerting very well. So this is one of the reasons why I just canned it and skipped it and got rid of it. So I'll bang off number 2. So this is just going to force the CIS-CAP tool to run on all the minions again. Instead of actually sending them off to the CIS dashboard, though, it's going to send the reports up to the minion, and it's going to put them into S3. So this is the lazy man's way of doing it, but this is just a web interface into the file server where the minions can upload their reports. They'll be there shortly. We've got an S3 bucket which is currently empty. Unfortunately, it's not super fast. Classic Java. Happy to field some questions while waiting as well. If anyone's, oh, we've got one, Windows box. So that one's it's only 5.2 meg this time, so it's not actually too big. But strangely enough, it looks very, very similar to the CIS dashboard. This is why I think the dashboard is just of no value to you. Don't even attempt to use it. But the browser's going to have trouble loading that. Should have something in AWS here now as well. Yep, so I've thrown them up there. The one that have actually finished at this point. 6.5, 6.8, 5.2 meg. Still rather large. One of them did error. Could be going to sleep. If I do this demo 3 though, this is it's actually just it's not overriding any of the pillar content I've already got pre-configured, but it's actually going to run OpenSCAP on Linux machines and CIS-CAT on Windows and macOS. It's going to do basically the same thing, just upload their HTML reports into the master and punch everything else up to the S3 bucket. And you'll see that the OpenSCAP reports, they actually look a hell of a lot better, and they're also a hell of a lot smaller. So we do have only about 10 minutes left, I think. So while we wait, any questions? Would anyone be interested in contributing to a formula that basically manages this kind of stuff? I like it. I think it's got a lot of potential. Sorry, the question was, what's my take on OpenSCAP? I like it. I think it's got a lot of potential. It's just really surprising that it only runs on Linux. I guess that, that's the whole Red Hat connection, I think it is. Looking at the code, it should be compilable. It should be immediately runnable on macOS. I think part of the problem is that there's no SCAP content beyond CIS. The Red Hat content's all just Linux systems. I don't know enough about the project or basically who's managing it, funding it, running it to know where it's going to go. It's definitely my preference. I'd rather see a smaller, lighter weight binary auditing tool on every system. Definitely not something Java-based. So I should have some OpenSCAP ones here now. Yeah, so the OpenSCAP ones, they're well under a meg, closer to kind of half. This was another gotcha actually that I found in the S3 module, and you will experience this with if you attempt to do this yourself without using a custom module. The metadata when you upload files to S3 by default, it'll set a binary metadata value. So I actually had to hack the S3 module in order to get text/HTML set properly. Otherwise, when someone goes in here, it just winds up downloading the file, which is not necessarily what you want. Once that's set properly, it just opens in a new tab and you can start to look at it. So it is a lot smaller, but it looks a lot better. And I think I see some inspiration for the Salt Enterprise GUI coming out of here as well. So any other questions, any other suggestions from people? I had it listed in there in the other tools. The question for anyone who missed it was, have I looked into SaltStack? And yes, I did. I actually found that about a month or two ago after I got confirmation that I was go for doing a presentation here. Kind of actually wasn't expecting it to happen, so I left a little bit of things to the last minute. But yeah, I hadn't come across SaltStack until I started doing research and then looked at it, and I'm really impressed. It's probably something we'll attempt to deploy back in Australia for some of our customers. It's the ones that we've actually got appliances sort of managing some of the things in their environment. We'll basically use it as our own tooling. I'm not sure about helping customers use it. You'd need the right team again. Besides this fellow over here, who else knows about SaltStack? Yeah. Yeah, okay, so from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, feel free to correct me on anything actually, it started out as something that was built on top of SaltStack. It's since been forked a bit. It's still using a lot of the Python code from the Salt project, but they're running it independently. And the rationale, I was stepping back to what it actually does. It does auditing and it does log collection, if you boil it down. It doesn't do any remediation at this point, as I understand it. They have converted the CIS benchmarks into YAML, and that's essentially how they're iterating through and checking everything. They've got some really good output, so they're basically outputting JSON. I think they're intending it to go to Splunk or Graylog or something else similar to that. So it becomes very easy to get some visualizations out of that. It is a better way of doing a dashboard than trying to run the CIS dashboard or anything else. Would you say that's about correct? Roughly? Is there anything I missed there with like what it can do? Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very important one. I don't know. I haven't actually deployed SaltStack, so I I said I literally found about a month ago. I haven't had time to deploy it. Read the docs, looked at the screenshots, went, oh, cool, okay, that's something I'll be coming back to. Yeah, a lot of the tools that I actually had listed there back in one of the earlier slides, the commercial ones that you pay a lot of money for, most of them don't do remediation either. They simply tell you there's a fire and wait for you to work out how to put it out. I've got mixed feelings about attempting to use the SCAP content for auto remediation. I think it's probably a really bad idea. I think we really need to be actually configuring our systems properly, and as I kind of suggested earlier, really investigating why something's non-compliant, understanding really why it is, and then fixing it properly using an actual formula. Again, just don't want to get into a whack-a-mole situation. Yeah. Some of them, you've got to understand within the context in your environment. Like as in limiting. Yep. Yep. And back with the compliance regimes, like they're only really telling you to follow these industry guidelines as guidelines. You can basically choose to not do things in them. Making the case to an auditor that, hey, we don't need to do that for these reasons is quite common. You often want to avoid it though, because you don't want to have to go through the laborious process of creating all the documentation, doing the paperwork to get an exemption. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I like the idea of editing the XML and simply stripping out the things you don't like, and then still using the machine consumable format to actually do the auditing. Well, it's about 2:30, so I think it's about time. If anyone's got any other questions, happy to have a chat afterwards. Yep, cool.